The entire point of taking notes is so that they become something useful to you. If you're taking notes that are disorganized, unclear, or incomplete, they're not useful, which is a total waste of time. In this video, I'm going to teach you how to take notes that are easy to study from. You're going to learn 4 note-taking tips that will increase how useful your notes are for when you need them most, which is when? Studying. But I'm going to start by explaining why you've been taking notes wrong. And yes, I will bet that you've been taking your notes wrong. Why start here? Because if you know what you're doing wrong, it becomes easier to fix. Hi, I'm Katie Azevedo from SchoolHabits.com. I'm a private executive function coach who teaches students and professionals strategies to learn and work smarter. You can find me here, and here. And if you like what you see today, please give it a like. Make sure you subscribe. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Okay, listen, I know that so many teachers turn note-taking into assignments. And as a teacher myself, I truly get why they do this because they want you to learn the material. And taking notes, honestly, it does lead to better comprehension, but only if you're taking notes right. So here's what usually happens. You might be assigned to read and take notes on, let's say, chapter 9. And you know that your teacher just sort of checks the notes for completion credit. So you're tempted to just fill your note pages with things that look like notes just to get the credit. I get it. I really do. I'm not like, oh my God, why would you ever do that? Like, I totally get it. And I know that you can get away with doing it in the moment, but like, don't do that. You are making things so much harder for yourself. When you don't have an actual note-taking strategy and you're just taking notes to sort of like get a check mark or earn credit or something, your notes become entirely useless, and what a waste of time. And while you might think that doing this is easier, you're making things harder. Because in the end, when it comes time to study for a test, you know the material less and you don't have good notes to study from. And this is why you need a note-taking strategy, which of course I'm going to teach you about here. Now, why? Because note-taking serves 2 purposes. If you have zoned out for whatever reason, zone back into me right here and listen. Note-taking serves 2 purposes. The first one is that writing down information helps us better understand it. Essentially, taking notes increases your comprehension. And number 2, taking notes the right way, which of course I'm going to teach you about here, lets you create notes that are easy to study from, that you can turn so easily into study resources. Okay, you got that? All right, so let's begin with the tips. How to take notes that are easy to study from. The tips that I'm going to share are for taking and designing your notes in a way that are going to be useful to you from the very beginning. Now, I feel like I've already said this like 5 times in the first 20 seconds of this video, but when we take notes with the intention of turning them into something that we're going to study from, studying when we get to that part is so much easier. So tip number 1 is don't write down what you don't understand. If the goal of taking notes is to study from them eventually, then you have to understand what the heck the notes are saying. They need to make sense to you. If we're writing down, like definitions and concepts and even just words that the teacher is using, maybe even writing up on the board, but we don't know what they mean, then our notes are pointless. And when we're taking notes on things that are hard and challenging material, it's so important to pause before you write down word for word whatever the teacher's saying, or maybe even whatever the textbook is saying, and ask yourself, do I get this? Think about it for a second before you write it. Ask yourself, do I understand what I just read in the textbook? Do all these definitions make sense to me? Am I understanding what the teacher is explaining in class? Does this example the teacher put up on the board make sense to me? Okay, you gotta think about what you're writing down before you write it down. Now, if the answer to any of those questions that I just rattled off is no, then you're gonna have to take a sec to reach a deeper level of understanding of what it is that you write down before you write it down. And that's not always easy, so I obviously have some strategies for how to reach that deeper level of understanding. Very basic, let's just start with raising your hand in class. Like, there is nothing wrong with raising your hand and saying, could you repeat that? Sorry, that doesn't make sense. Could you explain that another way? Chances are if you raise your hand, like 9 other people in class are like, thank gosh, that person raised their hand, because they're confused too. You are not the only one sitting there being like, what is happening? You can Google something. If you're taking notes from a textbook and you don't understand something, whether it's a vocab word, like just a hard word in the textbook, or it's a concept, Google it. You can Google anything followed by the word simplified, but put in simplified into your search bar and that'll give you a definition that's a little bit easier to understand. Okay, so how does doing this make your notes easier to study from? Because when you eventually turn your notes into something to study from, right? We don't just study our notes because we don't just reread our notes to study. We have to turn our notes into something that is like a quiz or flashcards or something that involves active recall. Let's take, for example, flashcards. When you're turning your notes into flashcards, you don't have to go back and try to interpret your notes. If you're trying to make a flashcard out of something in your notes, you don't have to be like, oh, well, what is this to begin with? And then you have to Google it then. And, honestly, you took the notes 4 days ago and you don't remember it, right? Try to understand what you're writing in the moment that you're writing it down, or perhaps just that day. If class is moving too fast and you don't have time to do it in the moment, later on that day, go back and make sense of your notes. Because when it comes time to make your study resources from your notes, you're gonna have a much easier time. All right, strategy number 2 is to put everything in your own words. Whether you are taking notes from a textbook or in a lecture class, you never want to use someone else's words verbatim. Why? Well, so many reasons, but primarily our brain likes to use its own expression. We all have our own way of talking, our own way of syntax and sentence structure and things like that. And when we try to use someone else's language, it might sound smart, it might sound neat, it might sound accurate, but it's not favorable to our brain. Our brain likes how we say things. Okay, so if your teacher says something in class and you're tempted to write it down word for word, that has nothing to do with whether you understand it or not. Whether you can write something down word for word has nothing to do with your comprehension. But if you were to take your teacher's word or, textbook, whatever, and try to paraphrase it and put it into your own words, you actually are initiating the learning process because you're saying, okay, they said it this way. What does that mean? Okay, now that I know what it means, you have that comprehension check. You say, now how can I put this into my own words? How can I reduce that, simplify it, make it, sound like me? All of that is the learning process, and you're getting a head start on it. And if you find yourself getting stuck, let's say you're reading a textbook and you try to paraphrase it and put it into your own words, and you're like, I can't do that. Well, that actually means that you don't understand what it is that you just read. Or if you're trying to paraphrase your teacher's words, okay, or something from your teacher's notes, and you find that you can't, it means that you don't understand it well enough. Because we can rephrase things we understand. We can't rephrase things that we don't understand. And you want that feedback. You want that data point. You want the feedback that says, well, you don't really understand this well enough. Why would we ignore that if the goal is to actually learn the thing? Okay, tip number 3, use clearly defined headings and subheadings in your notes. I'm going to show you an example of this in a minute, but if you use very clear headings and subheadings in your notes, no matter what type of note-taking system you're using, whether you're using 2-column notes or, outline notes or Cornell notes, that will allow you to take those notes down the road when it's time to study for a test and turn them so easily into something to study from. Now, the more specific your headings and subheadings, the easier it will be to create study resources from your notes. All right, so let me show you an example of what I'm talking about on the screen. All right, so let's say you're taking notes on World War II. So you might have, multiple headings in your notes, maybe something like the following. We've got post-World War I political landscape, pre-World War II political conditions, causes of World War II, things like that. Okay. Under each category, you would have multiple details with information about each topic. Chances are you would use something like bullet points, okay? And if you took your notes like this, right, with these clear headings, you could study one category at a time until you're ready to move on to the next chunk. When you organize your notes in this way, you're creating context for the information that you're learning about. Our brains like details when they're grouped together with other similar details so that we can visualize the larger picture. Quick tip, it's okay to go back and add headings and subheadings to your notes at a later point. We don't always get it right from the beginning. Okay, now like I just said, this is really helpful for when it comes time to study because you are studying one chunk or one cluster of information at a time. You're not studying, a vocab word out of context or in isolation. You're studying words and concepts and events, and in the case of my example, like a World War II event, in context. And our brain best remembers information in terms of how it's related to other information, right? We don't study discrete pieces of, things by themselves. It's hard for our brain to make sense of that. So you have the larger category, which is a heading or a subheading, the bullet points underneath it, and you study that chunk together. Okay, tip number 4, write notes with flashcards in mind. It is a really smart note-taking strategy to take your notes with the intention of turning those notes into flashcards down the road. So when you take your notes, keep your eyes open for, key terms, vocabulary, dates, people, and mark those clearly in some way. I don't know, highlight it, underline it, squiggle it, whatever. Anything that will make those terms obvious and stand out from your notes when you sit down to make flashcards from them. Now, as you see here, if you're using a 2-column method or perhaps the Cornell note-taking method, you're already kind of doing this, as the information you put in the left column is essentially what you would put on one side of a flashcard. The stuff on the right column is what you would put on the other side of the flashcard. Okay, so how does this make your notes easier to study from? When you design your notes with future flashcards in mind, you quicken the process of making your study materials when you get to that point. Instead of rereading your notes and flipping through all the information and being like, what do I even put on a flashcard? Like, I don't even know where those notes are. You can just flip through your notebook and find everything that you highlighted. Okay, and everything that you highlighted in green is gonna be on a flashcard. If you're using the 2-column or Cornell note-taking method, essentially you're already doing this, like I said, because almost everything in the left-hand column would be what's on a flashcard anyway. So that's why I'm a big fan, not necessarily of the Cornell note-taking method, unless you like that, but of just 2-column notes. Because you're designing them in a way that's going to make studying from your notes so much easier. I already said this in the beginning of the video. We don't study our notes. We make something from our notes to study from, okay? So we turn our notes into some kind of study material. That's why I'm mentioning flashcards, because that's the easiest, the simplest, and the cheapest. Also, to be real, the most effective. Okay, so let's recap the 4 strategies really quickly. The 4 ways to design your notes so that they actually become something useful to you. Now remember, the entire point of taking notes in the first place is to increase your comprehension of what it is that you're even taking notes on, and then to have notes that are designed in a way to make study resources from later on. So number 1 was don't write down what you don't understand. Number 2, put all the information in your own words. Number 3, use clearly defined headings and subheadings. And number 4, create your notes with flashcards in mind. All right, there we have it. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please like it. Make sure you subscribe. If you have any questions or comments at all, then leave them in the comments section below. And as always, thank you so much for watching.